back to Mr. Horror Global. Tonight's story comes from a co-worker of mine, three restless young men who chased the raw wild all the way to Africa and learned why one of them still swears you should never travel where there's no direct flight. Viewer discretion advised. No direct flight. A man once gave me a rule I've never been able to shake. Never travel somewhere you can't reach on a direct flight. When he first said it, I laughed because it sounded like nothing at all. Then he told me why he said it, and I stopped laughing. I sell cars for a living, and one of the guys I work with is a serious traveler, not the resort kind. He's been all over, mostly Southeast Asia, and we get to talking about trips during slow afternoons on the lot. I told him about a rough patch I once had in Europe, and he said, "That's nothing. Let me tell you about something that happened to a close friend of mine. It happened years ago, back in 2009, and I'll call the friend Danny, because that's easier than my co-worker's buddy for the next 20 minutes. Danny was in his late 20s then, him and two friends. One of them I'll call Mark, and the other one Scott. All three of them were between jobs at the time, all of them young and full of themselves, nothing to lose and no fear of anything. They'd all done their military service. They were at that age where you think the world can't touch you. And they had this habit. They'd get together, crack open some beer, and watch survival shows. You know the type. The guy who gets dropped in the middle of nowhere with a knife, and eats bugs and drinks terrible things and builds a fire and tells you this is what real travel is. They loved it. They'd watch it, and one of them would start in about how his military training was almost that hardcore, and they'd all argue, and somewhere in there the idea started, let's do it for real. Let's stop watching other people feel the wild and go feel it ourselves. So they picked a place. When you say raw nature, real wilderness, elephants and open plains and jungle, there's one place that jumps into everyone's head: Africa. In their minds, it was all savanna and campfires and sharpening a stick to defend yourself in the dark. That was the dream. They'd feel the land with their own bodies. They booked the flights. Now here's the first thing. There was no direct flight, so they flew to Hong Kong, spent a couple of days there, and then caught a plane from Hong Kong to Johannesburg. They landed knowing almost nothing. They'd read up a little beforehand, enough to know the crime there could be bad, that you had to stay alert, but that there were plenty of tourist spots, and as long as you didn't do anything stupid, you'd be fine. That was the general take. So they checked into a hotel and started their trip. For the first day or two, they were careful. They didn't leave cash in the room. They watched their backs on the street. But people are people, and by about the third day, the tension just drained out of them. The locals were friendly, warm, easygoing, kind. Danny kept thinking, what's supposed to be so dangerous about this? I honestly don't feel it. So they started going out at night too, no fear. Around the fourth or fifth day, they were getting ready to move on to the next part of the trip. They were out walking during the day, and Mark, who spoke a little English, got to talking with a man on the street. Just some local guy. They talked for a good while, Mark and this man, while Danny stood off to the side having a cigarette. Then Mark came over. There's an incredible tourist spot, he said. This guy says he can take us. You want to go? Danny asked what he was talking about. Mark said the man worked with a local travel agency run by people from the area, and they were asking $100 a head. $100 each felt steep. Danny said so. That's a lot. You sure we're not getting fleeced here? That's the thing, Mark said. He says we pay afterward, if we see the whole tour and we regret it. If we're not happy, we don't pay a cent. Come on, what have we got to lose? And here's something worth remembering. It was Scott, of all people, who didn't like it. Scott looked at the man and said, "These guys look a little rough to me. I'm not feeling this one." But Mark said, "Look, if it's a real agency, they'll have an office. Ask him." So Mark asked, and the man said, "Sure, there's an office. Get in the car, I'll show you." And the three of them thought about it and figured, it's one man and there are three of us. If anything feels off while we're driving, it's 3 against 1. So they got in. They drove a little longer than the 5 minutes he'd promised, and just as Danny's eyes started to move around the car, the man pulled up right in the middle of a busy part of the city and parked. And there it was, a normal-looking office, maps on the walls, papers about flights, the whole feel of a travel agency. A little different from what they were used to back home, but close enough. They went in, there were documents, flight-related paperwork, the works. The man who'd brought them gave this little shrug, like, "Satisfied? Anything else you need to check?" And Danny felt embarrassed for doubting him. "No, nothing. Sorry for being suspicious. Let's go." The man said, "Then let's leave right now." Danny asked how long it would take, and the man said, "If we leave now, honestly, you won't make it back today. You'll come back tomorrow. Don't worry about where you'll sleep. That's handled." They said okay, and they got in the car. They drove for more than 3 hours. It made Danny carsick, because at some point the paved road ended and it turned to dirt and it just kept going. But the country outside the city wasn't developed, so a rough road made sense to them. Eventually the man stopped the car and said they'd walk from here, and they walked. There wasn't any grand sweeping scenery, nothing worth all that. Just dry, half-desert ground with some scattered trees. They walked for about an hour and a half, resting now and then, getting hot and thirsty and sore, and the whole time the man kept saying, "Almost there, almost there." And Danny started to worry, because if this were a there and back trip, they should have hit the spot and turned around by now. But they kept going forward, always forward. Then another car appeared, waiting for them. They were actually glad to see it. They got in, and it drove, and one by one they nodded off. When Danny opened his eyes again, it was night. He woke up in the dark, and the man told them to get out. They'd arrived. And the moment Danny stepped out, one thought hit him hard. This is not a city. This is the deep countryside. There were buildings, but run down in a way you never saw in the city, and every single one of them was one story. Not one house had a second floor, and that was where he was standing now. He asked Mark what was going on. Mark said, "We sleep here tonight. Tomorrow morning we drive another 30-40 minutes and we see everything, all of it, the incredible stuff." Danny said fine. He asked where the hotel was. The man said there's no hotel here, but there's a private home we have an arrangement with. And Danny figured, sure, that's just how it works out here. So the man took them to a house, bigger than the others but still one story, and dropped them right in front of it. And then he said, "You 3 sleep well." Mark asked, "Where are you going?" "I don't have the money to stay here," the man said. "I'll sleep in the car or figure something out. Rest up. I'll come get you in the morning." "You're not going somewhere else, right? You'll be here first thing?" "That's right. Don't worry. These people are very kind." And with that, the man who'd guided them the whole way turned and left. They stood there, and a woman came out of the house, somewhere in her late 30s or early 40s, hard to say. She smiled and started talking, and this is where Danny's stomach first dropped. It wasn't English. She was saying something, but he couldn't understand a single word of it. The 3 of them looked at each other. "What is she saying?" "I don't know, but it's not English, I can tell you that much." The woman saw them floundering, and she just gestured, "Come in, come in." She led them to a small building set off to the side of the main house, like a little guest cottage separate from the rest. Inside it was simple, but set up so you could sleep. They dropped their bags, and she smiled, said something, closed the door and left. And they told themselves, "All right, it's not a strange place. They've got a spot for us to lie down. Isn't this kind of exciting?" They were joking around, laughing a little. Then a knock. Danny opened the door, and there was the woman, saying something none of them could follow, gesturing for them to come out. Food, they figured, and they were starving. They hadn't eaten anything since they got here, so they followed her. She led them into the big house, the main one. From the outside, it had looked old and beaten down, but inside there were rugs on the floor and a big, almost grand-looking dining table. There was an older man, clearly the head of the household, and some other family members too. They bowed a little, said hello, and it turned out none of these people spoke English either, but they were smiling, welcoming, saying things nobody understood, and the feeling was warm. It felt like a happy family home. They were waved to their seats, and food came out. Some bread, some kind of meat dish they couldn't name. Honestly, it wasn't to their taste at all, but these people had gone to the trouble, so they ate like it was delicious. And the family talked and laughed among themselves, and the whole thing had a cozy, homey feel to it. They were partway through the meal when Danny heard footsteps outside. He looked up, and about 5 people came into the house, all locals, and he figured more family or friends who'd come by. He went back to his food, but this group of 5 stood there talking only among themselves, laughing, warm and festive, and it started to feel strange. There was no way to join in. Nobody spoke a common language, and it began to feel like the 3 of them were the entertainment, like a bunch of foreigners had come to watch them eat. Danny leaned over. "Let's finish and get back to the room. It feels like we're intruding on their party." And Mark and Scott felt it too, so they made to get up, and the family waved them back down, gesturing, "No, sit, sit." The plates were cleared away, and tea was brought out. Bitter tea. Danny took a sip and thought, this is probably how it feels for a foreigner back home drinking one of our old medicinal teas. Bitter, strange, unpleasant. He only wet his lips, took the smallest sips. Then the old man made a gesture, and something shifted. Of those 5 people who'd come in, 3 were young women, and the women were seated, 1 each, right beside Danny and Mark and Scott. Suddenly it felt like a setup, like being paired off at some club. The women linked their arms through theirs and leaned in close, and everyone was smiling this warm, happy smile, and the whole thing was wrong. Scott lit up. He was thrilled, grinning at Mark like Christmas had come early. But Danny felt it in his gut. This isn't right. Because if these people were going to hand us women, they'd be asking for money. They'd be asking for something. This is free, and free is wrong. Mark said nothing. Scott said, "You want to leave? Go ahead. I like it here." Then Mark stood up suddenly and made a gesture. He had to use the bathroom, and the woman who'd been paired with him got up and led him off somewhere. So Mark was gone, and Danny sat there with his own partner touching his shoulder, his arm, saying things he couldn't understand, and Scott off to the side half out of his mind with delight. And Danny kept thinking, how do I turn this down? How do I get out of this? He said to Scott, "The second Mark's back, we get up. We need to be careful here." And Scott said, "No way. I'm happy. You want to go, go. Since when are you such a coward?" 20 minutes went by, and Mark still hadn't come back. So Danny got up to look for him. He gestured to his partner, "Stay here. I'm finding my friend." And she stood too, tried to pull him along with her. So they walked through the house together, and Danny noticed it was bigger inside than it had looked from the street. He went from spot to spot, calling Mark's name. Finally, Mark came walking out on his own. "Where were you?" Danny said. "You move into the bathroom?" Mark answered him low and fast, in their own language, because none of these people could understand it. "Listen to me. We have to get out of here tonight. We cannot sleep here. Keep your face normal. Smile. Come sit back down at the table, and don't let anything show." Danny said, "What are you talking about?" Mark said, "Don't raise your voice. Smile. Act happy. Just come sit down." So they went back, and Mark told them to link arms with their partners, play along, look delighted. Danny made himself lean into the woman beside him, and through a fixed smile, he asked Mark what was going on. Mark looked at Scott first. "Scott, snap out of it. Look at me." Scott sort of came around, blinking. "You too, smile, act natural, and listen. In that end room, back there, there's a big plastic box, clear plastic, and it is full of human teeth." Danny couldn't hold his expression for a second. "What did you say?" "The box isn't huge," Mark said, keeping the smile plastered on. "But from how many teeth are in there, it's got to be 100 people, maybe more. It is packed. And they're human. Those are not animal teeth." Danny asked how he'd even seen it. Did they just show him that? Mark said no. On the way back from the bathroom, he'd started opening doors, and his partner had just stood there and let him, and he'd looked inside. "Something is very wrong here. Stop drinking the tea." We get up, and we go. So Mark made a big show of yawning, and he put his hands together against the side of his face, the sleep gesture, and the people nodded, understanding, and gestured them back toward the little cottage. Good. They went. But here's what happened at the cottage. All three of them had been put in that one room, and the three women came in right behind them. 6 people in the room. Danny and the others waved them out. "We're sleeping, go, go," and pushed a little, and the women would not leave. And outside, the middle-aged woman who'd been guiding them the whole time smiled at them and pulled the door shut. And the instant that door closed, the 3 women started taking off their clothes. Now, if Mark hadn't seen what he'd seen, a young man far from home might have thought, "What luck, what a gift." But the mood was nothing like that. It was all wrong, and the 3 of them just stood there watching each other, reading each other's eyes. Mark leaned in. "Danny, how much of that tea did you actually drink?" "Barely any. I just touched it to my lips a few times." "Good. I didn't either. But Scott drank a lot of it." And they both looked at Scott, and Scott was gone, somewhere behind his eyes, gone. And it came together. Africa still holds on to its old folk beliefs, its old religions, more than we can picture, and there are plants out there that fog the mind, that turn a person hazy and pliable. Mark's read was that they'd brewed a mind-clouding herb into that tea and served it to them, and it fit. Back at the dinner table, Scott had already seemed off. Scott had always been the one going on about wanting a girlfriend, going on about women, but even Scott was never like this. This wasn't Scott anymore. But there was no time to sit and talk it out, because the women weren't just leaning in now. They were using force, real force, and they were strong. Mark said, "We're going to die here if we don't move. Hold them off, physically." So Danny shoved his away, and either he misjudged his own strength, or she'd been clamped onto him and lost her grip. But she went down hard, thudded to the floor, clutching her back. Mark shoved his and said, "Stop, stop." They couldn't understand English, but the tone, the volume, they'd get the meaning. Stop, stop, stop. But Scott was half gone, eyes rolled back, completely locked onto his partner. Mark went over. grabbed a fistful of Scott's hair and yanked, "Get up, you idiot." And Scott didn't respond at all. He was somewhere else. Mark looked around fast, grabbed something glass, something like a heavy ashtray, and cracked Scott across the head with it. Scott toppled sideways and cried out. Danny said, "Are you insane?" "You don't die from a knock like that," Mark said. He rolled Scott over, then, "Pull that woman off him. Keep them from moving." Danny hauled the woman off Scott and shoved her against the far wall, while Mark started tearing through the bags, repacking. Scott struggled up, swaying. "What is your problem? What are you doing?" Still not right in the head. Mark got the bags together. "I'll carry the packs. Can you get Scott on your back?" "I'll try." So Danny hoisted Scott up over his shoulder. Mark went to open the door, and it wouldn't open. It was a wooden door, and he shoved and it didn't give, so he started kicking it. And here's the part that raised the hair on Danny's neck. Every time Mark's foot hit that door, smoke curled in through the gaps. Someone was outside, and they had set something burning. Not a fire, understand. Something to make you groggy. Something to fog the mind, the same as the tea, but in the air now. Mark cursed and threw everything he had into it, and the door burst open. And sure enough, out there, someone had laid down something smoking. "Don't breathe deep," Mark said. "Carry him out." Danny got Scott up on his shoulder and ran. The second they got out, the three women came after them and grabbed on. And think about it. Danny had a grown man over his shoulder, and three grown women were pulling at him, and there is no winning that. "Mark," he shouted. "Mark!" And Mark cursed, dropped the packs on the ground, sprinted back, and punched one of the women straight down. Then he kicked the other two, grabbed them by the hair and threw them to the ground and said, "Move." He scooped up a couple of the bags again, and just then the main house lit up, and the middle-aged woman came out the front. Mark froze for half a second, staring. Then he let the backpack slide off his arm and drop. "Leave it. Go." They ran, but Danny had a full-grown man over his shoulder and couldn't get any real speed, and the middle-aged woman was yelling now, loud, and the feeling of it was unmistakable. "Where do you think you're going?" And she came running after them. "Mark, she's on us!" Mark stopped up ahead. "Get to me, as fast as you can, get to me." And when the woman closed in, Mark put his hand flat against her face and pushed her back down. If they'd misread all of this, there'd be no excuse for it. But this was not that. "If we're wrong about this, I am truly sorry," he said. "But this is not right. Move." And then they were out, past the last house, and the whole village was pitch black. Not one light, not a single window lit anywhere. Danny actually said it out loud. "Is that normal? Do villages here just not use lights at night?" "Which way?" he asked. Mark said, "Not back toward the car we came in. That man brought us that way. Go the other direction." And they walked off into the dark, toward nothing they could name. And here's the thing Danny said stayed with him more than anything. He'd braced for it. He expected screaming behind them, expected the whole village to come pouring out and chase them down. Nobody came, nobody. It was as if the place had never held a single living soul. Just silence, thick and total, so complete that the sound of their own feet on the dirt seemed to ring across the whole village. They kept walking, hearts hammering, taking turns with Scott, one carrying him when the other gave out. After a while, Scott started to come around, thrashing, "Why am I here? Where is this?" His head was splitting. Of course it was. He'd been hit. He didn't remember any of it. They set him down. "You with us? You remember what you did?" No, he didn't remember anything. So they told him, "Not now," and half carried him and kept moving. "I always figured Africa was just hot," It's not there. The climate was closer to a desert. This was September into October, and it was dry, and the days were warm, though nothing like the heat back home. But the nights got surprisingly cold, and their clothes were flimsy, thrown together summer things. They were freezing, so the three of them huddled together, three grown men shaking against each other, and they decided not to light a fire even though they had a lighter, because a fire in the dark tells everyone exactly where you are. Old army sense. They got through the night that way. When dawn broke and they got their bearings, there was nothing around them. Nothing. They'd wanted to live like the guy on the survival show, and now here they were, except the survival guy at least had a knife. They had a lighter and some cigarettes. That was it. Their lips were cracking. They were desperate for water, and they had no idea where they were. Still inside the Johannesburg area, they figured. They needed to find people or a road. Then Danny remembered how it always went on the show. When you're lost, you climb the high ground first. So they found a rise, not a real mountain but a good height, and dragged themselves up it and looked out, and far off, way out there, was a faint track, not paved, just a line where it looked like people had cut a rough path through the ground. That's our target, they said, and they pulled out every scrap of navigation they'd ever learned. That odd tree there, that's marker 1. That hill behind it, marker 2. Draw a straight line through them and walk it. And they went. But like I said, it was dry, brutally dry, and there was no water and no food, and their lips were splitting open. They walked and walked, and when they finally reached the track they'd aimed for, they couldn't go another step. Dehydration was setting in. Scott was in bad shape, worse than the others. He'd thrown up on the way, on an empty stomach, and Danny started to genuinely worry that the blow to the head had caused something, a bleed, something serious, but it was the right kind of track, they were sure of it. Cars used this, so they decided to wait until evening, until the next morning if they had to, because what was the alternative? Walk back into the desert. And not one car came, not a single one, all the way through to the next dawn. It broke something in them. Back home, even the smallest country lane gets one car a day. Here, nothing, and all three of them, right about then, felt it clearly for the first time. We might actually die out here, and it wasn't the exhaustion, or the cold, or the hunger. It was water, just water. They wanted water more than they had ever wanted anything. It was Scott who said it. I can't take any more. My body's done. We have to gamble. What gamble? We go back to the village. We find the car we came in, or any car anybody has, and we take it and we drive. If we've got a car, we just follow the road until we hit something. You want to keep walking? You got a better idea. And nobody did. Scott was the worst off, the most desperate, and Danny looked at Mark and said, I'm with him. We die out here otherwise. Let's do it. So they turned around and walked all the way back the way they'd come. Slower now, heads heavy, none of them talking, just the sound of 3 pairs of feet dragging through the dirt. Walk, rest, and right as the sun was going down, they reached the edge of the village, and there was not a single light on. And just then, one car came rolling into the village. Several people climbed out and went into the big house, and the lights inside came on. There were no power poles anywhere, so it had to be a generator, a diesel unit, something like that. They crept up to the car and eased the door open. If you've seen how those old cars are on TV, you can guess how it went. The door shrieked, rust on rust, this awful slow grind as it opened. They got in, and Danny felt around the ignition. Nothing, so they patted down the whole car, hands searching everywhere, and there they were. Keys. Danny nearly wept. He got the key in and was about to turn it when Mark grabbed his wrist. "Wait." "What?" "Both of you get in and wait for me." And before Danny could say a word, Mark got out and walked into that house. Danny wanted to scream at him and couldn't even raise his voice, and Scott was slumped in the back half conscious, and Danny sat there certain that any second this lunatic was going to get caught, and then what? But barely 5 minutes later, Mark came walking back out, and when he got in, Danny understood what he'd gone for. Water. There'd been a water bottle left in their room that first night, maybe a liter, and Mark had gone back to see if it was still there. It was. He held it up, gave a thumbs up, and said go. Danny fired up the engine. It was a stick shift, but he could drive one, and he had no idea which way to go, so he just floored it. And even as they tore off, they could hear yelling behind them in the dark. They couldn't understand a word, but the feeling of it came through fine. Something like, "You dogs?" And they were alive. They passed that one bottle around, Scott first, then Danny, then Mark, and it was gone in seconds. And Danny said the strangest thing about it was, he'd been thirsty in his life. He'd been thirsty in the army during training, but never like this, and the water didn't even feel like it hit his stomach. He felt it get absorbed right there in his mouth, felt it spread out through him as it went down. "We're alive," they kept saying. "We made it out." They drove through the night, following that rough track by the headlights, no idea where it led, no choice but to keep going. The fuel gauge, thank God, sat comfortably full, and somewhere around 4 or 5 in the morning, they finally saw lights. A real town with electricity, not a big city, but power in the windows. A town. They pulled in, and there was not a soul on the streets. Mark said, "Park it well outside town. If those people are locals, they'll know exactly where we'd run to." So they left the car a good distance off, waited, and went back in around 9 in the morning. Now there were people about. Mark went up to them. "Hello? Hello?" And not one person spoke English. Not one. So they drew a picture of an airplane. They wrote SOS in the dirt. But even when someone understood the airplane, they'd answer, and the answer was just as impossible to understand as everything else. A crowd started gathering around the three of them, and Danny got frantic. He was terrified. If even one person in this crowd was friendly with the people from that village, they'd be caught all over again. And in that panic, he reached for the one language everybody on Earth shares, because a stranger might not know SOS, might not know a word you say, but when a man drops to his knees, anyone anywhere in the world understands. This person is desperate. This person is begging for his life. And Danny, before he even decided to, went down on his knees right there in the middle of that crowd, rubbing his hands together, turning from person to person, and he begged in his own language, "Please, please help us. Please, someone help us." He'd never felt so desperate in his life. The crowd murmured, unsettled by a grown man on his knees, and after a while a woman came through. Younger, and she spoke English. Mark's eyes lit up like lamps. He got to her and let it all out. "We're from South Korea. We got lost. We nearly died. Please, we just need to get to downtown Johannesburg." And she looked at him and said, "This isn't Johannesburg." "Then where are we?" She said, "This is Namibia." It was a different country. When they'd driven all those hours at the start, they had crossed an international border, and none of them had known it. She said, "I'll give you a map. Drive to the border. When you reach it, there'll be police there, officials. Ask them for help." And because she'd seen a grown man on his knees, or for whatever reason, she loaded them up with food and water, piled it into the car, and they drove for the border. At the border there were guards. Mark launched into it again. "We nearly died, please." And these men understood some of the English, and they did not care, not a flicker. So Mark cursed under his breath, dug through his pockets. They'd left the backpacks behind, remember, and found exactly one thing, $20. He held it out. "Let me through, or take me to your police station, either one." And the guards took the $20, and they let them pass. And that was how they got back into South Africa, back toward Johannesburg. They drove asking their way, getting help here and there, fuel once from a stranger, directions from another, and eventually they reached their hostel downtown where their luggage was still sitting. But there was no money in it, because from the very first day they'd made a point of never keeping cash there. Here's the small mercy though. This was 2009, and the next year, 2010, the World Cup was coming to that country. So there were already workers from back home over there setting things up. Danny and the others managed to track some of them down, and those people helped them and helped them get home. All told, from the town where the woman gave them the map, it took about 3 days to arrange the flight back. And in those 3 days, and afterward, they learned what they'd actually walked into. Because the man who told me the story eventually explained it, or had it explained to him. We have our religions back home. Africa still holds on to its old folk beliefs, its indigenous faiths, more powerfully than any of us imagine. They'd been given something to drink. The women beside them at that table had been, in a sense, an offering, a gift laid on. And the teeth, in some of those old beliefs, people are used as sacrifices. 100 sets of teeth in a plastic box. The travel agency had been the doorway. Those 3 young men had come within an inch of simply disappearing. And think about why that plan works. If foreigners vanish in Johannesburg, their families come looking. But the searchers look in Johannesburg, and Danny and his friends had already been driven across a national border into another country entirely, into the deep middle of nowhere on a continent bigger than any of us picture it. Nobody would have thought to look there, and outsiders like them in that place and that time were looked down on, treated as less than nothing, and these 3 had walked right up to the house, invited and even offered to pay money, and in doing so had opened the door to becoming sacrifices themselves. If they'd just gone to the famous spots and taken pictures, they'd have been fine. But no, they wanted to feel the raw wild, and it very nearly ate them. And the only reason all 3 came home was Mark. Mark didn't drink the tea. Mark kept his head. Mark led them out. Because of Mark, Scott lived and Danny lived. I'll tell you, the version I've just given you is the cleaned up one. The man who told it to me said what really happened was worse than what he'd repeat out loud, more disturbing. He toned it down, and so have I, because some of it isn't the kind of thing you say. But at the end, he gave me the rule, and it's the same one I opened with. Never go where there's no direct flight. And if you can't get a direct flight, he said, be careful with the 1 connection places, and be very careful with the 2 connection places, because a direct flight means that country knows your country. It has people who speak your language, people who could help you. 1 connection, and the odds start dropping that anyone there has ever heard of where you're from. 2 connections, and you should understand you're going into the deep back of beyond, where you have no idea what beliefs, what people are waiting for you. Go where the direct flights go, he told me. Play it safe, because if you ever actually live through the other thing, you'll understand what real fear is. And here's the part 1 can't get out of my head. Not everything that happens out there makes it home. We like to think that if something terrible happened to one of us in some far corner of the world, we'd hear about it, it would be in the news, it would come back to us. It wouldn't. A great deal of it just ends where it happens, quietly, and no one back home ever hears a single word. So wherever you go, be careful.